stood in the darkness, my hand trembling slightly around my phone, watching more than 60 people dancing, drinking, and laughing on the land I had poured 32 years of sweat into keeping. They raised their glasses to celebrate my son's birthday, while I, his own mother, wasn't even invited. At exactly 11 p.m., I touched the screen. The entire farm plunged into darkness. The laughter stopped cold. Screams rang out. And then, through a speaker system they didn't even know existed, my voice echoed, distorted, icy. The owner is watching every single one of you. From that moment on, I knew they would never underestimate me again. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like, so it can reach even further. Just seconds earlier, music had been blasting across the Oregon Valley. Loud pop songs I had never understood, now swallowed whole, as if someone had yanked the plug on the entire world. The string lights hanging between the old oak trees snapped off. The pool behind the house became a bottomless black void. I heard the crash of shattered glass, a woman screaming in shock, a man swearing as he tripped over folding chairs scattered across the lawn. I stood behind the old wooden door of the barn, where Richard, my husband, used to keep the tractor and tools. The smell of damp wood, old engine oil, and nighttime earth blended together, so familiar that if I closed my eyes, I could almost believe I was 30 years younger again, back when we were both young, our hands caked with mud, but our hearts full of hope. Only one thing was different. Tonight, I was no longer the woman standing beside her husband. I was someone treated as if she didn't exist. I didn't step out. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, silently watching through the narrow crack in the door, where the glow of my phone screen reflected on my face. On the screen was the live feed from the security cameras they had no idea I'd installed months earlier. More than 60 people, my daughter-in-law's friends, my son's colleagues, strangers who had never greeted me once, were scrambling in panic like a flock of birds startled in the night. Someone slipped and fell into the pool, water splashing as screams erupted. Someone else stepped on an extension cord and yanked down an entire row of banquet tables. A 3-tier birthday cake collapsed, white frosting smeared across the tiles. I saw Samantha, my daughter-in-law, in her tight white dress, her hair carefully curled, her face panicked but still trying to shout, "Calm down, it's just a power outage." Her voice pierced the chaos, high and strained. Daniel, my son, stood in the middle of the crowd. I recognized his shape even in the dark. He was tall like his father, broad-shouldered, but now he stood frozen, both hands raised as if trying to calm everyone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw his lips moving, saw the glow from someone's phone lighting up his face, the face of the child I once rocked to sleep, held tight through stormy nights, and swore I would protect from every hurt in the world. I wondered in that moment whether he thought of me, whether it occurred to him that the woman who gave birth to him, paid every dollar of his college tuition, and stood behind every one of his successes, was standing somewhere very close, yet impossibly far away. I heard a man shout, "What the hell is going on?" Another woman whimpered, "I'm scared. Is this some kind of joke?" No one was laughing anymore. No music, no clinking glasses, just the raw, chaotic sound of fear and lost control. And in that moment, I realized a cold truth. How quickly all the polished appearances, the Instagram photos, the boasts about a perfect family, collapse the second the lights go out. I took a deep breath. My chest ached, not from fear, but from something far more bitter. I hadn't been invited. Not a single text, not one call, not one, "Mom, we're having a small party tonight. Would you like to come?" Instead, I found out about my son's birthday through a photo Samantha posted on social media. Birthday night at our place. Family and friends only. Family and friends. I didn't belong to either of those words. This was my farm, the land Richard and I bought when we were choking on bank debt, when every weekend meant driving nearly 2 hours from Portland, eating cold sandwiches, and sleeping in a beat-up trailer. I planted every tree, fixed every stretch of fence, cleaned every window pane, and yet tonight I stood like an intruder, hiding in the dark, watching others celebrate on my life. I felt no joy watching them panic, none at all. My heart didn't dance with revenge. What I felt was a strange stillness, as if some part of me had just died, and the rest of me had finally woken up. I knew that if I stepped out now, if I shouted that this was my home, that they had no right. They would only look at me with pity, or worse, see me as a difficult old woman ruining their fun. I had been seen that way before, too many times. So I chose the darkness. I chose silence. I chose to observe. As the noise slowly died down, I watched small groups begin to leave. They were rushed, awkward, no one thinking about goodbyes or cleaning up. Cars pulled out of the lot, headlights sweeping across the grass, leaving brief streaks of light before disappearing. Only about 20 people remained, huddled together, whispering, eyes darting around as if something were watching them from the dark. And something was. I didn't turn the power back on. Not yet. I wanted them to feel, long enough, what it was like not to belong, what it felt like to be pushed aside, the same unease I had carried for months. I wanted to remember this moment myself, so that later, if I softened, if I wondered whether I'd gone too far, I would remember this night, the night I stood in the dark on my own land. Finally, when the clock on my phone ticked over to 11:17 p.m., I closed the app. No further. Warnings. No final message. I let the darkness finish speaking for me. I turned my back and leaned against the cold wooden wall. My knees trembled, not from fear, but from a heavy question that rose in my mind and refused to leave. How does a mother get pushed this far? When did I become expendable in my own family? When did a lifetime of sacrifice turn into a burden, something that could be brushed aside for someone else's convenience? I knew that if I didn't stop here, if I didn't turn back and face everything that led up to this moment, tonight would be nothing more than a meaningless scare. What I had done wasn't the end. It was only the end of my silence. And to understand why I had to stand in the dark, why I had to shut off the power to my own farm, I needed to go back much further, to the days when I still believed that loving hard enough meant your family would never turn their back on you. My farm sits at the edge of a small valley in southern Oregon, where mornings are often wrapped in a thin layer of fog over the grass, and afternoons carry the scent of old pine from the distant forest. From above, it isn't the neat, perfectly squared kind of land you see in real estate ads. It stretches unevenly, hugging a gentle slope, winding around a small creek that runs year-round. To outsiders, it's just a large, quiet farm with income potential. To me, it is an entire lifetime. 32 years ago, this place was nothing but raw land. No fences, no clear roads, just weeds up to my knees, rocks packed into hard soil, and dead tree stumps left behind from an abandoned logging attempt. I remember clearly the first day Richard and I stood in the middle of it. It was cold in March, the wind cutting through us. I pulled my old jacket tight, and Richard smiled, a smile so optimistic it made me both love him and fear for him. He turned to me and said, "Maggie, can you imagine it? Right here, we'll build a house. Not big, but ours." We were so poor back then that if anyone had asked what our biggest asset was, I would have said Richard's old pickup truck and his set of tools. I was a nurse, working night shifts at the local hospital. Richard did whatever manual labor he could find: roof repairs, wall framing, plumbing, anything people would hire him for. We bought this land with a loan that left our wallets nearly empty every month. No one around us believed we could turn that wild land into a real home. But Richard believed. And when Richard believed, he worked. In those early years, we lived in an old trailer parked at the edge of the property. Summers were suffocating, winters drafty through every crack. I worked days, then came home at night to help him measure, clear rocks, burn dry weeds. Some nights we were so exhausted we ate canned soup straight from the pot, sitting on the ground staring at a sky full of stars without saying a word. And yet, in that silence, I never once felt alone. Richard built the frame of our first house with his own hands. It wasn't a dream home, just a simple wooden house, enough to keep out the rain and cold. I helped by holding ladders, handing him nails, sweeping up, cooking for us both. I still remember the smell of fresh lumber mixed with paint and sweat. Remember the blisters on my hands from gripping a hammer too long. Every wall that went up was progress, not just for the house, but for the life we were fighting for. When Daniel was born, the farm was still a mess. I held him in my arms, watching Richard dig drainage trenches in the rain, my heart torn between worry and pride. By the time Rachel arrived, the house was sturdier, with an extra small room and a front porch where we could watch the sunset. The farm grew alongside our children, and our children grew alongside the farm. Daniel learned to walk on uneven ground, falling and standing back up, scraped knees but shining eyes. Rachel loved chasing the chickens I kept, laughing every time they scattered. On weekends, Richard took Daniel to the open field behind the house to teach him how to throw a baseball, while I sat on the steps, sewing and watching them in the afternoon light. Those memories don't need photos. They're etched into me more clearly than any picture. The farm wasn't just a place to live. It was our children's first classroom, where they learned hard work, patience, and respect for things that aren't easily earned. Daniel helped his father build fences. Rachel helped me pick vegetables from the garden. Every family meal carried the smell of earth, grass, and real labor. We weren't wealthy, but we never felt poor. Then, one autumn afternoon, everything stopped. Richard died suddenly, a heart attack, so fast there was no time to prepare, no time to say goodbye. He collapsed right on the front porch, where we had sat together drinking morning coffee so many times. When I ran out, he was already there, eyes closed, his face cruelly peaceful. I remember screaming, but the sound felt swallowed by the vast space of the farm, as if no one could hear it. I became a widow at an age when I still believed there were many we moments ahead of us. The house felt too big, too quiet. At night, I heard the wind move through the trees and instinctively turned toward the right side of the bed where Richard used to sleep. Some mornings I made 2 cups of coffee before realizing I only needed 1. Every corner of the farm carried his imprint. The unfinished wooden chair he was building, the coat hook he mounted behind the door, the gravel path he laid by hand. Daniel and Rachel were grown, living their own lives. I didn't blame them for not being with me every day, but alone on this vast land, I finally understood what it meant to carry responsibility tied to memory. Selling the farm would have been easy, very easy. Less than a year after Richard's funeral, people knocked on my door offering to buy it. The prices they quoted would have let me live comfortably for the rest of my life in a small city apartment. I thought about it, I truly did. But every time I imagined signing those papers, I felt like I was erasing pieces of Richard, of our life together. This farm wasn't something I inherited. It was something we paid for with our youth, our strength, our sleepless nights. Selling it wouldn't have been a financial transaction. To me, it would have been a betrayal. So I refused, again and again. The farm became the place where I kept Richard with me. I cared for every tree the way he once did. I fixed broken things not because I couldn't hire help, but because I wanted to continue our habits. Some nights I sat on the porch and talked to myself, as if he were still listening. Others might call that weakness. To me, it was survival without losing myself. I didn't realize that my determination to keep this farm, my refusal to see it as just property, would make it something others wanted to take. Back then, I thought simply, as long as I'm alive, clear-headed, and standing on this land, no one gets to decide for me. I never imagined my greatest challenge wouldn't come from outsiders. It would come from my own family. Daniel is my eldest son. Even as a child, he was the one adults trusted. Not reckless, not overly mischievous, always thoughtful, always trying. When Richard was alive, he used to say, "Daniel's like me when I was young. He knows how to look ahead. He knows when to hold back." I believed that for years, and maybe that belief is what kept me from seeing his change sooner. Daniel was a good student. Richard and I poured nearly all our savings into sending him to law school. Those years weren't easy. I worked more night shifts. Richard took heavier jobs he used to avoid. But every time Daniel called, excited about an internship or a difficult case, I felt every sacrifice was worth it. When he graduated and became a lawyer, I cried. Not just from pride, but because I knew my son could now stand on his own. After Richard died, Daniel called me more than anyone else, at least for a while. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything, whether I wanted to come live with him in the city for a bit. I refused, as I refused every suggestion to leave the farm. Back then, Daniel understood. He said, "I know you love that place." I thought that was enough. Then Samantha appeared. Daniel introduced her one late spring afternoon. They drove down from Portland, their new car gleaming as it pulled up to the porch. I stepped outside, wiping my hands on my apron, forcing a smile. Samantha got out first. She was tall, slim, her blonde hair carefully styled, her high heels completely wrong for the gravel ground of the farm. She smiled beautifully, so perfectly I didn't quite know how to respond. "Hello, Maggie," she said, her voice sweet and clear. "I've finally met you." I nodded and shook her hand. Her hand was cold and soft, nothing like the hands of people used to labor. I didn't think badly of her then. I simply noticed the way someone who's lived long enough learns to observe before judging. The first time Samantha came to the farm, she walked around very slowly, not the curious stroll of someone visiting the countryside for the first time, but the deliberate survey of someone taking mental notes. Her eyes moved over the fence, lingered on the barn, paused at the wide field behind the house, before she leaned toward Daniel and asked him something quietly. I didn't hear the words, but I saw Daniel nod. "There's so much space here," Samantha said, sounding impressed. "It's rare to find a place this quiet and, with this kind of potential." I just smiled. To me, the place didn't need potential. It only needed peace. At dinner that night, Samantha talked a lot. She spoke about her work in marketing, about branding campaigns, about building personal images on social media. I listened but didn't fully understand. I was used to conversations about patients, night shifts, gardens, and weather. Samantha's world was far from mine. Some of her comments sounded harmless at first. This farm would get so much attention online. People in the city pay a fortune just to spend a weekend like this. I nodded and let it pass. I thought it was just enthusiasm from someone used to crowded places. But Samantha didn't stop there. Every visit after that, she mentioned potential again. Not potential for living, but for exploiting. Potential for events. Potential for vacation rentals. Potential for branding. The words repeated, often enough that they began to weigh on me. "I'm just saying," she laughed when she noticed my silence, "don't think too much about it." I told myself the same thing. Don't overthink. Don't be suspicious. Your son wouldn't mean harm. Your future daughter-in-law is just speaking from professional habit. I comforted myself with the very maternal trust I believed could never be wrong. But Daniel changed. At first it was subtle. So subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. He asked me fewer questions. Our conversations drifted toward work, plans, the future. He talked about optimization, about long-term investments. When I told him about repairing the chicken coop roof or replacing old water pipes, he just hummed, as if those things no longer mattered. Once I joked, "This farm is getting old, just like me." Daniel laughed, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He replied, "Old things need to change, Mom." That sentence stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Samantha began posting photos every time they visited the farm. Sunsets, outdoor meals, Daniel standing in the middle of the wide field. The captions were always polished, carefully worded. Peaceful weekends. An escape from the city. I wasn't in those photos. At first I thought she'd just forgotten. Then I realized my absence was intentional. Once, when I accidentally stepped into the frame, Samantha said, "Maggie, could you stand over there a bit? The light's better here." Her tone was polite, gentle. I stepped out of the frame without a word, but that was when the feeling of being pushed out of my own story truly began. Daniel didn't object. He stood there in silence, as if my being pushed out of the photo was something too trivial to care about. And that silence, more than any words, made me feel cold. I still tried to keep everything normal. I cooked, made coffee, asked about their work. I didn't want to become a difficult mother-in-law. I didn't want to plant the seeds of conflict. I had seen too many families fall apart because of misunderstandings left unspoken. I didn't want to be the one who caused that, but deep inside, a quiet unease began to grow. It wasn't the fear of losing the land. It was the fear of losing my place. The fear that, in my son's eyes, I was no longer the mother who had built this life alongside his father, but just an old woman living on a piece of land that was not being used properly. The first signs of takeover didn't come as grand actions. They came as questions that sounded caring. Do you ever feel tired managing such a big farm by yourself? Have you thought about the future? What if you get sick? Those questions were repeated often enough, gently enough, that if I reacted strongly, I would look overly sensitive. I didn't react. I just listened. And I began to understand that Samantha didn't see memories in this place. She saw numbers. She saw opportunities. And Daniel, my son, was standing between those two ways of seeing. And little by little, I realized he was turning his back on memory. I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. But in my heart, one thing became clear. If I wasn't careful, if I kept comforting myself with maternal love, one day I would wake up and realize that everything I had built no longer belonged to me. Nothing happened suddenly. There was no explosive moment I could point to and say, that's when it all went wrong. The boundary was erased in a far quieter way, like water seeping into the ground, slow, persistent, and by the time you notice, the foundation has long been cold and wet. At first, it was just suggestions. Samantha stood in the kitchen, holding the cup of coffee I had just made, her eyes moving around the room that Richard and I had spent nearly 10 years finishing piece by piece. "Maggie," she said lightly, like a breeze passing through, "have you ever thought about changing the kitchen cabinets? This style is a bit old-fashioned. If you painted them white and changed the handles, it would look so much brighter." I smiled politely. "I'm used to it. It's still fine for me." Samantha shrugged, as if I had just missed a rare opportunity. "Of course, I'm just suggesting. Sometimes a small change really lifts the spirit." At the time, I didn't respond. I thought maybe she was just speaking out of professional habit, seeing everything as something that needed upgrading or refreshing. I had lived long enough to know that not every suggestion is an intrusion, but those suggestions didn't stop. Next, Samantha talked about the living room. If you knocked down this wall and opened it up to the porch, it would be amazing. Open concept spaces are really popular. Then she moved on to Richard's old bedroom. It would make more sense as a home office. Leaving it empty like that is kind of a waste. I listened, and each time I did, it felt like someone was placing their hands on my memories and twisting them in a different direction. I started answering less. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to argue. I thought that as long as I didn't say yes, everything would stay at the level of words. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, while I was watering the garden behind the house, I heard an unfamiliar car stop at the gate. It wasn't Daniel's car. It wasn't a delivery truck. I turned off the hose, wiped my hands on my pants, and walked out. Standing on my porch were two men I had never seen before, holding tape measures and notebooks. Samantha stood beside them, hands on her hips, chatting animatedly. "Hi, Maggie." She turned to me when she saw me. "I brought these guys by to take a quick look. They're designers. Really good ones." I froze. "Take a look at what?" "Oh," Samantha said quickly, as if this had already been agreed upon. "Just some basic measurements, so I can get an idea of what a renovation might look like. We're not doing anything right away." I looked at the men. They had already started pulling out their tape, measuring the length of the living room wall. One crouched to inspect the wooden floor. Another was writing things down. They walked into my house as if they had permission. My heart started pounding, not from anger, but from a very clear sense of violation. "Samantha," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me, "you didn't ask me." She hesitated for a split second, then smiled. "Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I thought Daniel mentioned that you were considering some of these things too." I turned to look at Daniel, who had just stepped out of the car. He avoided my eyes for a brief moment, then said, "I just said we could think about it in the future, Mom." The future. Such a convenient word. I took a deep breath. "I don't need any measurements. Thank you, gentlemen, but today isn't appropriate." The two men looked at each other, then at Samantha, as if waiting for instructions. Her face flushed slightly, but she kept her smile. "Of course. No problem. I didn't mean anything by it. I just wanted to help you see more options." After they left, the air in the house grew heavy. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my hands trembling slightly. Daniel came closer. "You overreacted," he said quietly. Samantha just wants what's best for you." I looked at my son, searching for the eyes I remembered, the eyes of the child who used to ask my permission before climbing a tree. "Do you see," I said, "that she brought strangers into my house without asking?" Daniel sighed. "You always see everything as an invasion. You should be a little more open-minded." Open-minded? Another word that sounded so good. From then on, the small conversations grew more tense. Samantha no longer just suggested. She started talking as if changes were inevitable. "When we finish fixing this part, if we rearrange that area," I noticed how naturally she used the word "we," as if she were already a co-owner here. I objected, not loudly, not angrily, just saying no. And every time I said no, I was given a new label. "You're too attached to the past. You refuse to change. You're always so rigid." Daniel didn't say those things himself, but he didn't stop Samantha when she did. His silence felt like agreement. I found myself having to explain everything, even things that never should have needed explanation. Why I didn't want to knock down walls, why I didn't want to replace the windows, why I didn't want to turn Richard's room into a multi-purpose space. The small arguments became more frequent. Not big fights, but fragments of dialogue, enough to wear away intimacy. I said one thing. Samantha responded with a patient smile tinged with pity. Daniel stood between us, but little by little, I saw him standing closer to Samantha. Once I heard my own son say, "Mom always makes everything more complicated." That hurt more than I expected. I began to feel out of place in my own home. When they visited, I felt unnecessary. Samantha moved things around for convenience and forgot to put them back. She talked to Daniel about plans and ideas while I sat there like an audience member. Shared meals became shorter, more awkward. I ate more slowly, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to speak. One evening, while Samantha and Daniel were animatedly discussing upgrading the farm, I stood up to clear the dishes. Samantha watched me and said, "Don't worry, Maggie, we can handle these things. You just need to rest." Rest. As if I were already frail, as if I were no longer the person who built all of this. I went to bed early that night. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I looked around the familiar room and suddenly felt it was foreign. Not because the furniture had changed, but because my place in this house had changed. I was no longer the center, no longer the decision maker. I was being pushed to the margins, little by little, through gentle words and polite smiles. My relationship with Daniel fractured quietly. There was no big fight followed by forgiveness, just a growing distance. He called less, asked my opinion less. When I disagreed with Samantha, he looked at me with weariness, as if I were a problem to be solved. I began to understand something frightening. I was no longer seen as a mother, but as an obstacle, something that needed to be handled carefully so plans could move forward smoothly. And in that prolonged silence, I realized the boundary had already been erased, not by documents or signatures, but by attitude, by the way they spoke about this farm as if it no longer fully belonged to me. I still lived here. I still cared for every tree and every patch of land. But in the eyes of my son and the woman beside him, I had gradually become an outsider. That was when I understood. If I didn't stand firm, if I kept giving in out of fear of losing my child, what I would lose wouldn't just be the farm. I would lose myself. That conversation didn't happen in a closed room, nor did it begin with dramatic tension. It took place on a quiet afternoon on the wooden porch where Richard and I had sat hundreds of times watching the sun set behind the trees. That familiarity made every word spoken that day feel even heavier. Daniel arrived earlier than usual. He parked neatly, walked up onto the porch with a hesitant posture, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Samantha followed, her heels tapping sharply against the steps. I noticed the difference immediately. They didn't bring food, didn't ask how I was, didn't make small talk like before. The atmosphere felt exactly like meetings I'd seen at the hospital, when people came not to ask, but to announce. Daniel spoke first. "Mom, we want to talk seriously with you for a bit." I nodded, poured tea, and placed 3 cups on the small table. My hands were steady, but something inside me tightened, like a string pulled taut. "Go ahead." Daniel cleared his throat. "You know the farm is big. There's a lot of work, and you—" He hesitated, searching for words. "You're not young anymore." The sentence wasn't loud or harsh, but it landed on the porch like a stone. I looked at my son, the child I once carried across this land, and for the first time I saw the distance between us clearly. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice even. Samantha jumped in quickly as if she'd been waiting. "Maggie, don't misunderstand. We're just worried about you. Such a big farm, handling everything alone. It must be exhausting. What if something happens?" Worried about me. I had heard that phrase many times lately, but today it carried a different tone. It was no longer concern. It sounded like a conclusion already reached. Daniel looked at me, his eyes tinged with pity. "We think maybe it's time to share the right to use the farm. You'd still be the owner, of course, but we'd handle the main management. That way you wouldn't have to work so hard." Share the right to use. I repeated the phrase silently. It sounded harmless, even reasonable, if framed as children helping an aging mother. But I wasn't helpless. I still drove myself, fixed fences, managed every bill, and more importantly, I had never said I wanted to hand anything over. "So, you want me to give you the farm?" I asked bluntly. Daniel shook his head. "Not give, share, together. You'd still live here just like before. We just make the big decisions." The big decisions. I didn't ask more. Samantha had already launched into her pitch, her voice bright like she was presenting a business plan. "Just imagine, this place is so beautiful. If we rent it out for events, it would be amazing. Weddings, birthdays, weekend retreats. If done right, it could bring in a decent amount every month." I looked straight at her. "Who is we?" She hesitated briefly, then smiled again. "Our family, of course." Family. Coming from her, the word felt strangely hollow. I set my teacup down. "This farm is not a place for parties." Samantha tilted her head, her tone gentle. "But you're not using all of it. Leaving it like this is such a waste." A waste. A word I had never used to describe my life. Daniel continued, no longer circling the point. "Mom, honestly, keeping the farm like this isn't efficient. It's like a dead asset." A dead asset. I heard every word clearly, and in that moment I knew something had broken. Not on the farm, but inside me. 32 years of sweat, blood, and memories, mine, Richard's, our children's childhood, in my son's eyes, reduced to something unproductive. "A dead asset?" I repeated quietly. "You're calling the place you grew up, the place your father collapsed, a dead asset?" Daniel frowned. "Don't be so sensitive. I'm talking about economics." "Economics?" I laughed, but the sound was dry. "So you studied law just to talk to your mother like an investor?" Samantha cut in, her voice edged with impatience. "Maggie, I think you're being too emotional. These days, everyone has to be practical." Practical. I knew that word well. It was often used to cover things people didn't want to name honestly. "I don't need your kind of practicality," I said, dropping the polite address for the first time. "And I don't need anyone managing my life." The air thickened. Daniel stood up, pacing the porch as if trying to calm himself. "You're overreacting. We don't mean any harm." "Then what do you mean?" I asked. "Bringing strangers to measure my house? Talking about renting it out without asking me? Calling my life's work a dead asset?" Daniel turned back to me, irritation flashing in his eyes, an expression I had never seen before. "You always turn everything into a personal attack." I stood up too, facing my son. The evening wind swept across the porch, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. Peaceful surroundings, but my heart wasn't. "You know," I said slowly, "I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of losing my right to decide." Samantha crossed her arms. "That's not fair. We're just trying to help." "Helping without asking," I replied. "Helping by imposing." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You can't just stubbornly hold on to everything forever. One day you won't be able to handle it." That sentence sent a chill through me. Not because it was wrong, but because it showed me he had been imagining my helplessness for a long time. "Are you waiting for that day?" I asked. Daniel fell silent. Samantha looked away, avoiding my gaze. I looked at both of them, and in that moment I understood clearly. This was no longer a discussion. It was a dangerous proposal, wrapped in the paper of concern. If I agreed today, tomorrow I would be expected to agree again, until I no longer had the right to say no. "You should leave," I said. Daniel froze. "What did you say?" "I said you should leave. Now." Samantha opened her mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "There's nothing more to say. This farm is mine. Until I invite you, you have no right to be here." Daniel stared at me, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "You're kicking me out of my own home?" "I'm asking you to leave the farm," I corrected him. "Those are two different things." In that moment, my son looked at me like I was a stranger, and the most frightening part wasn't that look. It was the realization that I no longer recognized him either. The man standing in front of me wasn't the boy who used to run after me in the garden, but someone weighing interests and control. They left in silence. No goodbye, no promise to talk again. I stood alone on the porch, listening to the engine start, the tires crunch against gravel, and then everything fell quiet. I sank into the old wooden chair, gripping the armrest until my hand hurt. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my son, not because he could hurt me physically, but because I realized he could do something worse. Take away my right to own my life, while still believing he was doing the right thing. That night, after Daniel and Samantha left, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat on the wooden chair on the porch for a long time, until it was completely dark, until the sound of crickets rose from the edge of the forest behind the farm, not because I was thinking anything profound, but because my mind was empty. A strange feeling crept in, like missing a familiar step on a staircase and feeling your heart race as you realize something in your life has slipped out of place. I went inside, locked the door, made a cup of tea, and forgot to drink it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind tapping lightly against the window frame, wondering where I had gone wrong for my son to sit across from me and talk about my life like a project that needed to be optimized. Near dawn, I finally drifted off for a short while. When I woke, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, and my phone vibrated softly on the bedside table. A message from Rachel. Rachel is my youngest daughter. She's been different from Daniel since childhood. Quieter, more observant. She works in education, not glamorous, not fond of arguing. Since Richard passed, Rachel has called me often, not to make polite inquiries, but to listen. I opened the message, thinking she was probably asking if I was okay after yesterday's meeting. "Mom, are you alone right now?" I replied immediately. "Yes, I'm at the farm. What's going on?" The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. After a long pause, Rachel finally texted back, "I don't know how to say this, but you need to know." My hands trembled slightly. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my back straightening instinctively. "Go ahead." The phone stayed silent for a few more seconds, then the screen lit up. I was accidentally added to a group chat, not a normal family group. I frowned. What group? The group name appeared in the screenshot Rachel sent. Care Plan, Mom. I read the name over and over. My heart slowed by one beat, as if my body were bracing itself for an impact. "Please read it," Rachel texted. "I'm sorry for sending this to you, but I can't take it anymore." I opened the image. The first message that hit me was from Samantha. "We need to agree on how to talk to her. Lately, she hasn't been as clear-minded as before." Not clear-minded. My ears rang, but I kept reading, line by line, the way people watch an accident unfold in slow motion, unable to look away. Daniel replied right after, "I feel the same. She overreacts and doesn't take suggestions well, very hard to work with." Work. That word again. Someone else in the group, I guessed a friend of Samantha's, asked, "Do we need legal advice? If this is about managing an elderly person's assets, there are a few options." Samantha replied, "I have a lawyer friend. She specializes in cases like this. When an older person lives alone, it's easy to argue they're no longer capable of managing things." I put the phone down on the bed, my hand covering my mouth. A chill ran straight down my spine. Not vague fear anymore, but clarity. Everything was starting to take shape. Yesterday's words on the porch weren't spontaneous. They were part of a carefully discussed plan. Rachel sent more screenshots. This time, Daniel's message. If we start with sharing usage rights, she'll accept it more easily. Then we gradually take control. The key is making her believe it's for her own good. For her own good. Tears fell onto my phone screen. Not loud, dramatic tears, but the kind that come when you no longer have the strength to react. I had prepared myself to be misunderstood, to be seen as stubborn. But I had never imagined my son sitting in a group chat discussing how to gradually control me like a problem to be managed. There was another message from Samantha, longer and more detailed. "She's emotionally attached to the farm, so we need to separate emotion from decision-making. If necessary, we can note that she's not as stable as before. This is for everyone's long-term safety." Long-term safety. I let the phone fall to my side and leaned back against the wall. The familiar room suddenly felt foreign. The photos on the walls, Richard and me, the kids when they were little, seemed to look back at me as if asking how I had ended up here. Rachel texted again, "Mom, I don't agree with this. I said so in the group, but they brushed it off. I'm scared for you." I took a deep breath, even though my chest ached. "Thank you for telling me," I typed back. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I'm sorry," Rachel wrote. "I feel like I betrayed you by being in that group." "No," I typed slowly. "You're the only one telling the truth." I set the phone down on the table and walked to the window. Morning sunlight stretched across the fields, over the rows of trees Richard and I had planted together. Everything was still there, solid, as if it had never been placed on a scale. Only I was unsteady. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, feeling as though all my strength had been drained at once. For a few minutes, I let myself collapse. I cried, without holding back, without shame. I cried for my husband who was gone, for the son I thought I knew, for myself, for being naive enough to believe that family bonds were strong enough to protect me from cold calculations. But in that very moment of weakness, something else appeared. Not anger, but a sharp, cold clarity. The pieces slid into place. Samantha's words, her calculating looks, Daniel's changes, the proposal to share usage rights. Nothing was vague anymore. They were the first steps of a clear plan to turn me into someone without decision-making power on my own land. I wiped my tears and took another deep breath. My hands no longer shook. A different kind of silence settled in, not the emptiness of shock, but the stillness of awareness. I realized something painful. Once someone decides you're no longer clear-minded, everything you say afterward can be used against you. Emotional reactions become loss of control. Silence becomes lack of awareness. Anything can be twisted to fit their narrative. I picked up my phone again and texted Rachel. "Leave that group," she replied instantly. "Mom." "Leave it," I repeated. "And don't argue anymore. I don't want you pulled into this." "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked. I looked out at the fields again. "I can't say yet, but I won't let them decide for me." I turned off the phone and sat still for a long time. No more tears, no more panic, just one clear, frighteningly bright thought. If they were planning step by step to take control of my life, then I had to stay one step ahead. And I knew that from this moment on, I could no longer act like a mother, guided only by emotion. I had to act like a woman who understood her own value, her own rights. That mental breakdown hadn't weakened me. It had stripped away the last layer of innocence I was still holding on to. I didn't want a war, but I wouldn't let anyone turn me into a bystander in my own life. For the first time since Richard passed away, I felt truly clear-minded, and that clarity told me one thing. If I didn't protect myself now, there wouldn't be another chance. After that night, I didn't cry again, not because the pain disappeared, but because I understood this clearly. Tears wouldn't help me hold on to anything. They would only make me look weaker in the eyes of people already prepared to use that weakness as evidence against me. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Oregon was still wrapped in a thin layer of mist, the field in front of the house hazy like a painting. I made coffee, no sugar, no cream, and drank it slowly. For the first time in days, my hands didn't shake. My thoughts were arranged in a new order, cold but clear. I knew what I needed to do. The first thing I did wasn't calling Daniel, and it wasn't talking to Samantha. I called someone Richard had introduced me to years ago, someone I never thought I'd need, a lawyer who specialized in asset protection and elder rights. His office was in Salem, more than an hour's drive from my farm. I didn't make an appointment by phone. I drove there directly, parked, and walked in like any ordinary woman seeking advice. Nothing more. I didn't cry. I didn't rant. I didn't waste a single word. He was in his early 50s, hair streaked with gray, voice deep and unhurried. He let me finish without interrupting, nodding occasionally. I showed him the screenshots Rachel had sent, the messages Daniel and Samantha never thought I would see. He read them carefully. When he finished, he looked up at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only confirmation. "Mrs. Maggie," he said, This isn't a normal family conflict." I stayed silent. These are very clear signs of financial and psychological abuse of an older adult. They're gradually building a narrative that you're no longer capable of managing your life and your assets. I nodded. "That's what I thought too." He frowned slightly, perhaps surprised that I didn't react more strongly. "The most important thing right now," he continued, "is that you don't give them any evidence against you. No loud arguments, no emotional reactions in front of them, and absolutely do not sign anything." "I won't," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "You're clear-minded, independent, and fully legally competent. But if they want to pursue a legal route, they'll try to make you look unstable. You need to prepare." Prepare. That was the word I'd been waiting for. I left the lawyer's office with a checklist forming neatly in my mind, like a plan. Not a plan for revenge, but a plan for protection. And I decided I wouldn't tell anyone about it. I started with the smallest things. That night, I took screenshots of every message and saved them to a separate hard drive, then backed them up to the cloud. I labeled dates, times, sender names, no detail missed. I didn't reread them over and over. I didn't need to hurt myself again. I just needed them to exist, intact, as truth. 2 days later, I called a locksmith from the neighboring town. Not someone the family knew, not someone who had ever fixed Daniel's locks before. A stranger, efficient, quiet. I changed every lock. The front door, the back door, the barn, the old horse shed. Daniel used to have a key to just in case. When the locksmith asked, "Do you want extra keys for family?" I simply smiled, "No." That night, when I turned the new key in the lock and heard the sharp click, I felt something small but essential return to me: control. Then came the cameras. I didn't install big, obvious ones. I chose small cameras with no indicator lights, placed in corners outsiders wouldn't notice, but that covered every critical area: the entrance, the porch, the barn, and the dirt road leading from the gate into the farm. I paid in cash, used no card, left no easy trail. Throughout all of this, I told no one, not Rachel, not my neighbors, certainly not Daniel. I still answered my son's calls when he phoned, my voice normal, neither cold nor warm. I didn't mention the porch conversation or the secret group chat. Daniel seemed surprised by my silence. He made small talk. I answered briefly. Samantha didn't call. She sent one very polite message. "How have you been lately?" I didn't reply right away. I waited a day, then answered, "Fine." One word. The lawyer had told me, "Don't confront them directly. People making plans like this are often confident in their own cleverness. They'll make a mistake soon." And I believed him. I started observing more, not with emotion, but with clarity. I remembered the times Samantha had asked about land deeds, insurance, whether anyone else was listed on the property. Before, I'd thought it was just curiosity. Now every question had a different meaning. I took notes, brief, just dates, times, key points, like a professional, not a wounded mother. Some nights I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart still aching. I didn't pretend I was fine, but I didn't let the pain control my actions anymore. I thought of Richard. If he were still alive, what would he do? He wouldn't yell. He wouldn't beg. He would stand quietly, wait for the right moment, then act decisively. So would I. One afternoon, while walking along the western fence line, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the dirt path leading into the farm, not deep, but new. I stood there for a long time, not angry, just attentive. The cameras would tell me more. That evening, I checked the system. Nothing unusual yet, but I knew if they believed I'd softened, they would soon test another step. Maybe an unannounced visit, maybe a family talk with a third party, or a gentle legal move presented as help. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't need to stay far ahead. I just needed to stand still and let them walk into the space they thought was safe. The trap wasn't something dramatic. It was patience. It was not reacting when they expected me to, not stopping them when they believed they were advancing. I didn't cry anymore, not because I was tougher, but because I understood this clearly. If I broke down, they would call it evidence. If I stood firm, they would eventually reveal who they really were. And I was ready to wait, not for revenge, but to protect my life on the very land where I had lived, loved, and would never surrender to anyone through silence. I didn't learn about it through a phone call, and no one said it to my face. I learned the most painful way possible, through the security camera system I had installed myself. That morning started out completely ordinary. Oregon's sky was a rare, clear blue, the air light, the scent of damp grass from the night's rain still lingering. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop to check email, and out of habit, I opened the camera system. Not because I suspected anything, but because it had become part of my new awareness. And then I saw them. Daniel's SUV appeared first, rolling slowly through the gate. I froze, my hand still on the mouse. Daniel hadn't told me he was coming to the farm today. My heart tightened slightly, but I tried to reassure myself. Maybe he was just stopping by to pick something up or check on something. 5 minutes later, a small truck carrying tables and chairs arrived. Then another with the logo of a local catering service. I sat up straight. The unease spread quickly, cold and unmistakable. The camera on the porch showed Samantha stepping out of the car, a light-colored dress, oversized sunglasses, moving with the confidence of someone who believed this place belonged to her. She pointed, said something to the delivery crew, and laughed loudly. I couldn't hear the sound, but I didn't need to. The way she stood there in the middle of my porch said everything. I looked at the clock. 10 a.m. My phone didn't vibrate. Not a single text. Not a single call. Not one word to remind me that today was Daniel's birthday. Not one word to say they were preparing to do something. Right here, on my farm. I opened another camera, the one in the backyard. Tables and chairs were being set up around the yard. String lights were being hung on the wooden posts Richard had built. Ice chests, speakers, decorations. Everything was arranged quickly and professionally, as if they had done this many times before. And I wasn't invited. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. I sat motionless in front of the screen, my heart pounding so heavily I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. A part of me still clung to the most unreasonable hope. Maybe they would call me later. Maybe this was just preparation. Maybe I was misunderstanding everything. Then the camera caught Samantha lifting her phone, turning around to take a wide shot of the farm. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed softly. A social media notification appeared. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from, but I opened it anyway. The first photo showed Daniel and Samantha standing in front of the porch, sunlight slanting across them, looking like a perfect couple. The caption underneath was short, cheerful, and sharp as a blade. Celebrating my love's birthday at our home. So grateful for this place and the life we're building. Our home. I read it 3 times. Each time the words scraped at my eyes. Not a single line mentioned me. Not one word said this was his mother's farm. Not a single trace that I existed in that story. I went back to the cameras. Guests were starting to arrive. People laughing, hugging Daniel, wishing him a happy birthday. Samantha stood beside him like the hostess, directing, greeting, her hand resting possessively on Daniel's back. And Daniel, my son, was smiling. He smiled easily, naturally, as if nothing were missing, as if the woman who gave birth to him, raised him, and held on to this land with her entire life didn't exist. My chest tightened. A familiar pain, but deeper this time, slower. I stood up, went into the bedroom, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time in many days, I allowed myself to cry. There were no sobs, no wailing, just tears flowing quietly, soaking the collar of my shirt. I cried for my absence on my son's birthday. I cried for the moment I realized I had been erased from a picture I had once painted myself. I cried for Richard. If he were still alive, this would never have happened. Not because he controlled things, but because he was the boundary. And when he died, that boundary disappeared with him. I cried exactly once. When the tears ran dry, I sat still for a long time. No more trembling, no more choking in my throat. Just a cold emptiness, like the aftermath of a violent storm. I stood up, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red, but my gaze had changed. I returned to the living room and opened the cameras again. The party was in full swing. Music was playing. Glasses were raised. Someone clapped and called Daniel up to speak. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw him lift his glass, say a few sentences, and then everyone laughed. No one asked, "Where's his mother?" No one wondered why the true owner of the farm wasn't there. Samantha posted another story. This time, a slow-motion video of people clinking glasses under twinkling lights. The text across the bottom read, "Making memories at our place." Our memories, our place. I turned off the screen, not because I couldn't take it anymore, but because I had seen enough. That afternoon, I didn't go outside. I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and for the first time, I wasn't writing to remember. I was writing to plan. Not a plan fueled by anger, but a deliberate, public counteraction that couldn't be denied. I wrote bullet points slowly, carefully. I thought about what the lawyer had said. Let them feel confident. Let them take another step. And I realized they had just taken a very big one. Hosting a party on my property without permission, without my presence. Publicly declaring it our home. That was no longer a family matter. That was evidence. I opened my computer and saved every post, every story, every image. I took screenshots, recorded dates and times, saved links. I reviewed the camera footage, marking each frame. Vehicles entering the gate, tables being set up, guests arriving, Samantha directing, Daniel making a speech. Every piece fell into place. When night came, I sat alone in the quiet house. Outside, the party was probably still going. Laughter might have been ringing out, but it no longer reached me. Something inside me had closed, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I was no longer the mother standing on the sidelines, painfully watching her son be led astray. I was no longer the woman afraid of being labeled not clear-minded. From the moment I saw the words, "our home," on that screen, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer, not to reclaim affection, but to reclaim the truth. That year, Daniel's birthday passed without his mother, and it was also the day I officially began preparing for the moment when everything would be called by its proper name, in front of everyone, publicly, clearly, and without turning back. The second party didn't come as a surprise, the way I might have expected. It came exactly the way people used to, taking other people's space, tend to act, confident, loud, and convinced there would be no consequences. I found out about it 2 days earlier, not from Daniel, and certainly not from Samantha. I learned through the cameras and through a stray message from an old acquaintance in town. I heard there's going to be another big party at Maggie's son's farm this weekend. Another party. I didn't reply. I didn't ask for details. I just sat by the window for a long time, watching the sunset fall over the fields. Late summer Oregon was gentler, the wind carrying the scent of dry soil and pine needles. A scene so peaceful that anyone looking in would never imagine that, inside me, a silent trial was being prepared. I didn't interfere. I didn't call. I didn't send a message asking them to stop. I let everything unfold exactly the way they wanted, because that night I didn't plan to play the role of a mother anymore. I planned to play the role of the owner. That afternoon I prepared carefully. Not fancy clothes, just a dark jacket, low shoes, a fully charged phone. I checked the camera system, the speakers, the backup power. Everything was ready. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me the most. The trembling had vanished, replaced by a cold calm. I left the house at dusk, not through the main gate, but along the Western Service Road, the one only Richard and I had used back when we were first clearing the land. A narrow path, overgrown with trees, enough for a car to pass without drawing attention. I parked near the old barn, where the party lights didn't reach. From there I could hear the music echoing, laughter, the clinking of glasses, more people than last time, louder, more confident. I opened the camera app on my phone. The yard was brightly lit, lights everywhere, tables filled. I counted quickly, more than 80 people. Some unfamiliar faces, some people I had once known who had come to my house for tea, now standing there as guests in a place that wasn't theirs. Samantha appeared on screen in a light dress, her hair carefully styled, a glass of wine in her hand. She moved through the crowd like a host, smiling, hugging guests, gesturing toward the main house. And Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, wearing that familiar smile that now felt distant. Not once during the minutes I watched did he glance toward the house where I was, as if he had decided I no longer belonged in this picture. I took one deep breath, not to gather courage, but to mark the final moment of hesitation. I looked at the clock. 10:58 p.m. I waited. I waited until the music was at its loudest, the laughter at its peak, when people had had enough to drink to be less alert, but not enough to lose control. I waited until Samantha stepped onto the porch, clapping her hands to get everyone's attention. Through the camera, I saw her raise her glass. Her lips moved as she spoke, maybe a speech, maybe something about family, about home, about memories. 11 p.m. exactly. I tapped the screen. The entire farm's power shut off. Not section by section, not flickering. Total darkness. For the first second, there was absolute silence, the kind you only hear when all your senses are stripped away at once. Then the screaming started, overlapping, panicked. What's happening? Is the power out? Does anyone have a flashlight? Chairs fell. Glass shattered. People tripped. Someone shouted after being pushed off the porch steps. Water splashed from the pool. I waited another 10 seconds, long enough for fear to spread like a wave. Then I turned on the speaker system. The voice came through, low, slow, processed through a filter. Not the voice of a mother, not the voice of someone familiar, the voice of ownership. This farm has an owner. The screaming stopped abruptly, as if someone had squeezed the crowd's collective throat. You are currently on private property without permission. I heard someone swear. Someone else started crying. Samantha shouted, "Who's doing this? Is this some kind of joke?" I didn't answer right away. Everything happening right now, the voice continued, is being recorded. Time, images, audio. A new wave of panic swept through. People began pushing toward the exit, but in the dark, no one knew which path was safe. Voices called out, feet ran, objects crashed to the ground. "Please leave the area immediately," the voice continued, calm, steady. "The police have been notified." That was when I turned on the lights at the main porch, just enough so people could see where I was standing. I stepped out of the darkness, not rushing, not shaking, not hiding. I stood upright, hands folded in front of me, the light falling across my face. Some people recognized me instantly. I saw their eyes widen, confusion spreading. "That's Maggie." "The farm owner?" Samantha froze. The wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the wooden floor. Daniel turned toward me, his face drained of color, his mouth opening but no words coming out. "I am the legal owner of this farm," I said, this time without the speakers, in my real voice clear in the terrifying silence. "And none of you have the right to host events here without my permission." A few people stammered apologies. Some lowered their heads and quietly left, but Samantha didn't. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but defiant. "What are you doing? You're scaring everyone." "I'm protecting my property," I replied. "You've used it repeatedly without authorization." "Daniel is your son," Samantha yelled. "We're family." "Family does not mean taking," I said, not looking at her, but straight at Daniel. "You know that." Daniel lowered his head. At that moment, red and blue lights flashed at the gate. The sound of a police car cut through the night, clear, undeniable. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I called the police," I said, "and I will be reporting the trespassing." Samantha turned to Daniel, her voice urgent. "Say something." Daniel stayed silent. For the first time, he didn't step in to shield her. When the police arrived, I explained everything clearly and briefly. Proof of ownership, camera footage, evidence of unauthorized use, no extra emotion, no personal attacks. Samantha argued. She talked about misunderstandings, about family, about good intentions. But under the lights, in front of dozens of people who had just witnessed the chaos, her words sounded hollow. The mask didn't fall with a blow. It fell under light, the light of truth. When the last guests left, the farmyard grew eerily quiet. I stood there, watching the lights come back on, listening to the wind move through the trees. That night there was no laughter, no music, only a heavy silence. But this time, it belonged to me. The night of judgment was over, and everyone knew clearly this was not our home. This was mine. The police stayed at the farm for nearly an hour after the crowd had dispersed. They worked calmly and professionally, favoring no one. I sat on the wooden chair on the porch, a light jacket over my shoulders, answering each question in a steady, clear voice. My name, my address, proof of ownership. The moment I discovered the unauthorized use, I added nothing, left nothing out. I simply told the truth, precise and complete. One younger officer took notes while the other checked documents. When they confirmed that the farm was in my name, that there was no rental agreement or authorization of any kind, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer an awkward family misunderstanding. It was a clear case of trespassing. A report was written on the spot. Samantha wouldn't stay still. She paced back and forth, her voice rising as she tried to draw attention back to herself. "You don't understand," she said. "She's not normal anymore. She acts erratically, locking doors, cutting the power. We're just trying to help her." "Crazy old woman," I heard the accusation without her having to say it outright. It hovered in her eyes, in the careful way she chose her words. She was trying to paint me as unstable, so everything I had done would look like a sudden outburst. I didn't react. The older officer looked up and met Samantha's gaze. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "we see no indication that Mrs. Maggie lacks capacity. On the contrary, she's been very clear. What we do see is an event held on private property without permission, which is a violation." Samantha froze. Daniel stood a few steps away, his face pale. He looked at me, then at the officers, then at Samantha, as if he were realizing for the first time that there was no one left to stand between him and the consequences. "Say something," Samantha urged him, her voice lower now but frantic. "Tell them." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. I saw the collapse in my son's eyes, not fear of the police, but the crumbling of the wall he had trusted, the belief that everything will work out. There was nowhere left to hide. The officers finished the paperwork and handed me a copy of the report. "Do you want to pursue this further?" one of them asked. "I will follow the law," I replied. That was enough. No bitterness, no threats, just clarity. When the police cars drove away, the farm fell silent again. Samantha lingered for a few minutes, as if waiting for something to change. Nothing did. Finally, she turned and walked quickly toward the car, her heels striking sharply against the gravel. No goodbye, no final glance, just a hurried, humiliating retreat. Daniel stayed behind. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at my son for a long time. I didn't feel the surge of anger I once had. I felt only a deep exhaustion. "You didn't think," I said slowly, "but you allowed it." Daniel lowered his head. His shoulders sagged as if under a weight he had never carried before. I didn't comfort him. I didn't accuse him further. Any words now would have been unnecessary. I went inside, got some water, took a small sip. When I returned to the porch, Daniel was still standing there in silence. "You should go home," I said. "That's enough for tonight." He nodded and walked away without looking back. The next morning, I drove into town and went straight to the lawyer's office. I placed the police report on his desk, along with the evidence I had prepared earlier: screenshots, camera footage, social media posts. He reviewed everything carefully, then looked up and nodded. "You have a very solid case," he said. "If you want, we can file a formal complaint." "I want to," I replied. Not for revenge, not to intimidate, but because I needed a boundary recognized by law, one that couldn't be bent by sweet words or vague accusations. I signed my name, each stroke of the pen firm and final. From the lawyer's office, I went straight to the notary. I brought my old will and read every line. It had been written at a time when I believed family bonds were enough to keep everything safe. I realized I had been wrong, not because I loved my children, but because I hadn't set limits. I rewrote my will, not long-winded, not emotional. I divided everything clearly and transparently with clauses that protected my assets and my right to make decisions until my very last day. I didn't do it in anger. I did it in complete clarity. That afternoon, I called Daniel. He came, quieter than ever before. We sat facing each other in the living room, sunlight slanting through the window. I didn't beat around the bush. "You are still my son," I said, "but from today on, there will be boundaries." Daniel looked up, his eyes red. "I understand." "You have no right to use the farm without my written permission," I continued. "No events, no rentals, no managing on my behalf. And any discussion related to my assets must go through a lawyer." Daniel nodded without objecting. "This is not a punishment," I added. "This is a boundary. Justice is not revenge. Justice is putting everything back where it belongs." He stayed silent for a long time, then said softly, "I was wrong." I didn't say, "It's okay." I didn't say, "I forgive you." I only said, "From now on, you need to learn how to respect." When Daniel left, I stood alone in the quiet house. No more forced laughter, no more party lights, just the sound of wind across the fields and the familiar scent of old wood. I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. Justice doesn't bring joy. It brings an upright spine. And for the first time in a very long while, I knew one thing for certain. I no longer had to protect my life with emotions. I had placed it exactly where it belonged, into my own hands and under the light of the law. After that night, things didn't end quickly the way people often imagine when they hear the word justice. There was no bold full stop, no applause, only quiet, gradual consequences that could not be avoided. Daniel didn't speak to me for many weeks. I didn't call him. He didn't call me either. That silence was different from our previous distances. This time, it didn't carry tension, but a heavy emptiness, as if a layer had been stripped away and the person underneath didn't yet know how to stand firmly. I learned about Daniel's marriage not from him, but from Rachel. She called me one evening during a light rain, her voice cautious. "Mom, Daniel and Samantha are living separately." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because I needed to be sure I'd heard correctly. "When?" I asked. "A few weeks now," Rachel replied. "Everything is messy." Samantha moved out almost immediately after the police incident. I turned off the stove and sat down in a chair. Inside me, there was none of the satisfaction people often expect in moments like that. No joy, just a very deep sigh, like when you watch a house collapse and realize it had been cracking for a long time. Later on, Daniel told me himself, in a brief phone conversation. His voice sounded tired, stripped of its usual confidence. "She said I betrayed her," he said. "She said I didn't stand by her when she needed me." "And you?" I asked. He was silent for a long time. I don't know whose side I was on all this time. That marriage didn't fall apart because of a power outage, and not because of the police. It fell apart because the truth was pulled into the light, and that light didn't shine only on Samantha, it shone straight on to Daniel. In the months that followed, pieces of the story surfaced one by one. Expenses Daniel had never paid attention to, accounts in Samantha's name, but funded with shared money. Investments he believed were for the future, which turned out to be nothing more than fuel for a glamorous image. Daniel called me one afternoon, his voice unsteady. "Mom, did you know? I paid off almost all of her credit card debt. I thought it was for work, for her personal brand. But there was nothing." I didn't say, "I warned you." I didn't need to prove I was right. I only asked one question. "What do you see now?" He answered very quietly, "I see that I was used." From then on, Daniel began trying to make amends, not with grand apologies, but with awkward, clumsy actions. He emailed to ask if I needed help fixing the fence. He texted to ask if I was okay when the weather turned cold. Once, he left a crate of dry firewood on the Yee's porch and drove away without knocking. I saw everything, but I didn't rush to respond. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I had learned a lesson that was far too costly. Words can be beautiful, but only time and actions reveal the truth. Daniel asked to see me several times. I refused the first two. The third time, I said, "Not yet." He didn't argue. He only replied, "I understand." I observed. I didn't ask about his personal life. I didn't interfere. I let my son walk through the consequences of choices he had once believed were right. And in that silence, I realized something. Daniel was beginning to change, not because he lost Samantha, but because for the first time in his life, he had no one left to blame. 6 months passed. Winter came and went. Snow melted slowly across the fields. Trees began to bud again. The farm entered spring with a different kind of calm, no longer disrupted by plans, gossip, or scrutinizing eyes. I lived at my own pace, woke early, tended the garden, read books, called Rachel. The days weren't dramatic, but they were steady. Daniel kept his distance. He didn't come to the farm. He didn't ask about documents. He didn't mention anything related to usage rights or management. He went to work, handled his own life. Rachel told me he had moved into a smaller apartment and sold the expensive car Samantha had once been so proud of. One early spring morning, while I was trimming rose bushes by the porch, I received a text from Daniel. Just one sentence. "Are you doing okay, Mom?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, "I am." 2 words, just like the way I once replied to Samantha. But this time, I wasn't closing the door. A week later, I texted Daniel again. "If you'd like, you can come back for dinner this weekend." The typing indicator appeared for a long time. Then he replied, "I'd really like that, but I don't know if you're sure." "Saturday night," I wrote. 6 p.m. Daniel arrived right on time. Not early, not late. He stood on the porch holding a small bouquet. Not expensive flowers, just wild flowers neatly tied together. When I opened the door, he looked at me like someone stepping into a place he had once hurt. "Thank you, Mom," he said. Dinner unfolded slowly. No one mentioned Samantha. No one mentioned the lawsuit. We talked about simple things. Daniel's job, the weather, the garden. There were silences, but they weren't uncomfortable. Just the necessary caution of 2 people learning how to speak again from the beginning. After dinner, we sat on the porch. The sky darkened. The lights inside the house came on. Daniel looked out across the field, then turned to me. "I know things will never be the same again," he said. "Good," I replied, "because the way things were wasn't okay." He nodded without arguing. "I don't expect you to forget. I just hope for a chance to do things right." I looked at my son carefully. Not to search for the child he once was, but to see the man sitting in front of me with all his mistakes and lessons. "Everything has to start over," I said. "Not from feelings, but from respect." "I understand," Daniel said. That night, when Daniel left, I stood alone on the porch, listening to the sound of his car fade away. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel relieved either. I felt right where I belonged. The price had been paid, not through someone's collapse, but through real change, slow and painful. And I knew that if Daniel wanted to remain in my life, he would have to walk that path on his own 2 feet. Not like before, but as a new beginning, with clear boundaries and truth no longer hidden. The next meeting between Daniel and me didn't come long after that first dinner. There was no formal invitation, no elaborate preparation. One morning, he simply texted me, "Do you have time for coffee?" I stared at that message for a long time, not because I hesitated, but because I realized I was no longer afraid of that question. We met at a small cafe in town, a place Richard and I used to stop whenever we went to buy supplies for the farm. Daniel arrived a few minutes early. He stood up when he saw me walk in, a little awkward, unsure whether he should hug me or just say hello. I nodded and sat down. The air between us was still cautious, but no longer heavy. We talked slowly. Daniel told me about his job, his new apartment, about nights spent learning how to be alone after years of being used to someone else's voice. I listened without interrupting. There were long silences, but I didn't rush to fill them. I had learned that silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's where truth reveals itself. Finally, Daniel looked straight at me. "Mom," he said, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness right away, but I want to say I'm sorry. Not just for what happened, but for not seeing you as an independent person." I looked at my son for a long time. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to list old wounds. I saw someone who had fallen, slowly getting back up and knowing exactly where he had gone wrong. "I forgive you," I said, "but I don't forget." Daniel nodded. He didn't expect me to forget, and I didn't want to. Because memory is the boundary that keeps things from repeating themselves. Forgiveness, to me, isn't erasing what happened. It's accepting it as part of my life and moving forward without letting it define me. My will remained unchanged. I made that clear, and Daniel didn't object. He understood that some decisions no longer belonged to emotion, but to protection. I didn't rewrite my will to punish anyone, nor to hurt anyone. I wrote it to remind myself that my life, until my very last breath, is still mine. The farm gradually returned to its original meaning. No more loud parties, no more glittering lights for show. Just the wind, the smell of soil, and a familiar rhythm. I fixed a few small corners, not to upgrade, but to care for them. I planted another row of trees on the western side, where the afternoon light is gentlest. Every morning, I walk around the farm not to control it, but to feel it. Some afternoons, Daniel stops by, never unannounced, always asking first. He helps me mend a fence, replace a rotten board. We work side by side, speaking little, doing more. No old roles, no old expectations, just two adults learning how to be close in a new way. In those quiet moments, I found myself again, not the mother who must always sacrifice, and not the woman who has to prove anything. I am simply me, a person who has walked through loss, betrayal, fear, and stood firm. I returned to reading, to journaling, to learning how to say no without guilt. I understood that love should never come with the cost of losing oneself. The greatest lesson I carry isn't how to protect assets, but how to protect boundaries. Loving does not mean enduring. Family is not a place where you must stay silent when you are hurt. True peace doesn't come from pleasing everyone. It comes from living in alignment with your values. I chose a peaceful life, but one with limits. I open the door, but I don't remove the lock. I allow others to step in, but I don't allow anyone to take control. And within that balance, my heart feels much lighter. Evenings are quiet now. I sit on the porch, watching the sun sink over the fields. The light at the end of the day isn't dazzling, but it's warm. It doesn't erase the darkness that came before, but it's enough for me to clearly see the road ahead. If you've stayed with me to these final lines, I want to pause for a moment, not to tell more of my story, but to listen to yours. Each life, especially in the second half of the journey, carries losses, silences, and moments when we ask ourselves, am I living true to my values? If somewhere in this story you caught a glimpse of yourself, a mother, a father, someone who loved too much and endured too long, then you are not alone. Please tell me where you're listening to this story from, a big city, a small town, or a quiet corner of the world. If you've ever stood at the boundary between love and self-respect, I invite you to share a few thoughts in the comments. I read every word, and I value every story entrusted to me. If this story gave you even a little strength, a little courage, or simply the feeling of being understood, please tap the like button to help pass that feeling on to others. And if you'd like to continue walking with me through stories about family, boundaries, and late but necessary awakenings, please subscribe and stay tuned for the next episodes. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for staying until this moment. Your presence is the gentlest light after years of darkness.